Good morning. I'm Myron, Frans, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. Welcome. Today I'm joined by State Economist Kalambokidis and Budget Director Margaret Kelly to present the November forecast. There are copies of the slide deck on either side here to hand out if anybody if you don't have one already. I urge you also to review MMB's forecast documents online. If you go to mn.gov/MMB under the tab for forecasts and updates, you can find more materials and additional detail there. Today's forecast is a reality check. If you recall, when I announced the February forecast earlier this year, one of the most important and consistent messages I relayed was one of caution. And why caution? Because every forecast has risks and uncertainties, and last February's projections had a lot. I recall someone pointing out that we used the word risk over 20 times during our presentation last February. The status of federal fiscal and budget policy remain uncertain. The risk that our current economic expansion will come to an end is real. We must always remember how quickly surpluses can turn to deficits. And if you two would like to sit down, you come on down. I introduced you so quickly, I thought you were already over here. These are the people who actually know the details, so you're going to want to talk to them pretty quickly. After 8 straight forecasts showing a positive balance, today marks the first forecast projecting a deficit in over 4 years. As we examine the current biennium, the 2018-2019 biennium, we are forecasting a negative balance of $188 million. I'd like to remind everyone where we are at this point in the current 2-year budget cycle. The 2018-2019 biennium began on July 1 of this year and will end on June 30, 2019. So as of November, we are 4 months into the current biennium with 20 months remaining. It's also important to remind everyone that our forecast must be based on current law. Now, examining the 2021 biennium, I'll call it the next biennium because 2020-2021 is too hard to say, we see a projected negative balance of $586 million. Because there is no budget currently passed for the next biennium, we refer to all balances for that time frame as planning estimates. Before I look back at how we got to this point, I want to state that we have time to address today's projected deficit. Governor Dayton's leadership has ensured that the state is prepared for moments like this, and the state has over $1.6 billion in its budget reserve. We also have an opportunity this upcoming legislative session for the legislature and Governor Dayton to come together and address this deficit. I'll talk more about the timing later on. Minnesotans need to know that their leaders are capable of putting aside partisan politics to reach a compromise that ensures our state's solid financial foundation is restored. I look forward to working with Governor Dayton and the legislature to enact a budget that works for all Minnesotans during the next legislative session. So I want to do a quick look back. So this is called a look back to the February forecast. Remember, today all of our projections are being based and compared to our February forecast. And it's important to go back there to take a look at what happened during that February forecast and the session that occurred in 2017. This is a complicated story. There are 2 major foundations I want to lay for our budget forecast or economic forecast today. One, the budget and tax bills from the 2017 legislative session created a new starting point, or a lower base, if you will, for this forecast. And number 2, reduced U.S. economic growth forecast with lower forecast revenues and increased spending projections going forward. So let's examine this further. To understand today's projections, we must understand the decisions we made in 2017. The first column on this slide is entitled February 2017 Forecast. Last February, we were projecting a positive balance of $1.65 billion for 2018 and 2019. Since then, the legislative action has changed the budget in 2 ways, by reducing revenues and increasing spending. You can see in column 3 that since the conclusion of the regular session and the special session, general fund revenue has been reduced by $657 million in this biennium. Nearly all of the decreased revenues are attributable to the large tax bill passed by the legislature and to the dedication of sales tax revenue from the general fund to the highway users tax distribution fund. I also want to draw your attention to the $816 million of spending investments. As expected by Minnesotans and required by increases in costs and inflation, we invested in our state through increased spending in our students in pre-K programs, K through 12 schools, and our institutions of higher education. Also through local property tax relief, and we also stabilized the healthcare market that I'll talk about a little bit later. It should come as no surprise that I believe the investments we made were the right thing to do. This is business as usual for the Dayton administration and preserves the high quality of the Minnesotans have come to know and deserve. We have made critical investments each year that Governor Dayton has been in office, but we've also done so over the last 4 years by living within our means. Keith? Because of the changes in the revenue and spending explained in the last slide, we now have new numbers from the end of the legislative session on which to base our new forecast. So this is why I wanted to go through slide 1 and now slide 2, is to show that we have a new beginning point based on the legislative action last session. This numbers on this slide are projections showing how those economic conditions will impact the legislature going forward into the next biennium and going forward. These new numbers show our November forecast. The second column shows a deficit of $188 million in the 2018-2019 biennium. The numbers from the end of the legislative session are the new starting point for Professor Kalambokidis for her economic forecast today and for Budget Director Kelly to explain her new budget forecast for spending today. Generally, while the economy is growing, it is growing at a slower pace than previously predicted. A weaker economic outlook, along with changing underlying forecast assumptions, have lowered our revenue forecast and increased our spending forecast. Revenues are projected to decrease by $559 million for this biennium, with lower projections for all the major tax types. This is primarily the result of a weaker economic outlook and lower than expected income tax receipts at the close of the prior fiscal year. One-time carry-forward spending is a significant portion of the projected spending increase of $398 million for the biennium. Budget Director Kelly will explain that in more detail shortly. The last slide that I want to talk about before bringing up Professor Kalambokidis is to explain the legislative funding component. This slide shows a more realistic picture of what the deficit looks like when you include the funding for the legislative branch of government. In order for the legislature to receive its full funding, it will need to pass an appropriation bill this next session. Governor Dayton has made it clear that he will sign a clean legislative appropriation. But this appropriation is not current law and cannot be considered in our forecast today. So current law appropriations for the House and Senate do now include $15 million from a court order this summer. When you add the remaining $114 million for the legislative funding, we see a deficit of $302 million for 2018-2019. Before I turn it over to Dr. Kalambokidis, I want to take a moment to sound like a broken record, and that is our definition of this forecast as a reality check. It serves as a reminder of the risk that I've spoken about before, and a reminder how vital it is that we come together to solve this deficit during the 2018 session. Again, there is time to restore our fiscal stability during the legislative process. And now I'd like to turn over to Dr. Kalambokidis, our state economist.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the U.S. outlook and how it has changed since we last produced a forecast. And then I'm going to move to Minnesota's economy, and then I will talk about the revenue change. So the first slide shows annual percentage change in U.S. real GDP growth, both the history, so the dark bars are the history, and then the light bars are the forecast by IHS Economics, Minnesota's macroeconomic consulting firm. So the height of the gray bars that forecast continued growth show that the U.S. economic expansion is expected to persist through our forecast period. Well into the 9th year of the U.S. expansion, the economic fundamentals remain good, with the economy continuing to add jobs and consumer spending continuing to be supported by improvements in income. However, the chart also illustrates some forecast risks. First, the rate of U.S. economic growth in this forecast, between 2 and 2.5%, is below the 3.1% average annual growth that we saw during the 20 years prior to the Great Recession. Slow growth makes the economy more vulnerable to shocks, reducing its capacity to weather an unexpected downturn. And the current economic expansion, as I said, is now in its 9th year, well beyond the average length of post-war expansion. The longer the cycle gets, the riskier the bet that growth will continue. The second slide compares the current real GDP forecast to the prior forecast. So this is our forecast comparison chart. The dark bars show IHS's November 2017 outlook, the one that informs this forecast, and the light bars show their February outlook. The chart shows that, as you heard from the commissioner, the outlook for U.S. economic growth has weakened since the February forecast. The U.S. economic data coming in this year has been mixed, with slowdowns in residential and business construction, but improvements in net exports and in business equipment investment. In addition, earlier this year, IHS removed from their baseline outlook federal fiscal stimulus in the form of individual income and corporate tax rate cuts and increased infrastructure spending. That assumption of fiscal stimulus in their February outlook was expected to support economic growth starting in 2018. The removal of that assumed fiscal stimulus has helped lower the U.S. economic outlook relative to February. So this outlook that we're using now, IHS's November 17 outlook, was released on November 6th, so well before the U.S. House and Senate passed their bills. And so therefore, this outlook incorporates no change to U.S. tax policy relative to current law. So any economic impacts of tax law changes that emerge from Congress now through this reconciliation process are not reflected in this forecast and are a source of uncertainty. Staying on this chart for a bit, IHS has slightly lowered their forecast for real GDP growth in 2017, so this year, from 2.3% in February's outlook to 2.2% now. Lower forecasts for real consumer spending, that was one of the things that came down when the fiscal stimulus assumption was removed, and business capital purchases more than offset improvements in net exports to lower the 2018 growth forecast from 2.7% in February to 2.5% now. The next slide shows growth in total U.S. wage income. So the variable that we're measuring here is the sum of all the payrolls of all the employers in the United States, and the height of the bar, of each bar, shows how that sum will grow over time. In this outlook, wage and salary income grows more slowly than IHS had assumed in February, and that's primarily because data about actual wage income came in lower than expected. We now know that wage income for the United States grew much more slowly in 2016 than had been forecasted. 2.9% is what we know happened in 16 now, compared to 4.2% assumed in February. And it also appears that total wage income has grown more slowly than expected so far this year. 2017 wage income growth is now expected to be 3.4%. Down from 4.8% in the prior forecast. And then the growth rates for subsequent years are brought down about 0.3 percentage points relative to the prior forecast. So let me turn to Minnesota's economy. As I said, well into this long economic expansion, Minnesota's steady economic performance and tight labor market continue. The state is currently adding jobs at the same rate as the nation, and that steady job growth has kept the unemployment rate low. And that's what we're depicting in this chart, the unemployment rate for Minnesota and the United States, where Minnesota is the dark line and the United States is the light line. Minnesota's unemployment rate currently stands between the low points of the prior two expansions at 3.3%, well below the US rate and the lowest we've seen in 17 years. Statewide, there are about as many job vacancies as there are unemployed job seekers. Together, high demand for labor and low unemployment have supported growth in Minnesota wage and salary income. All year, average hourly wages by private sector employees in Minnesota have been growing faster than the comparable rate for US workers, and in some months as much as twice as fast. And all year, Minnesota's labor force participation rate has been ticking up. It reached 70.5% in October, 7.8 percentage points above the US rate. The increased participation rate coincided with job growth in Minnesota that exceeded the US rate during the middle months of this year. And the increase is notable because Minnesota already had one of the highest labor force participation rates among states and already was above the US rate. And it's occurring as the large baby boomer cohort is retiring. The next slide shows the forecast comparison for growth of Minnesota wage and salary income. So this is the same as the slide I showed you for the United States. It's the same variable, that total wage and salary income. And as a reminder, this value, so as long as the bars are positive or above zero, that means total wage and salary income is growing. And so there's no lower wages in this forecast. It's all total wage and salary income are all growing. And in fact, it's accelerating. You can see it in the dark bars, the growth rates go up. But it is lower growth than what we had forecast in February. So this sum, the sum of wage and salary income, grows if we have more people working or if we have wages per worker growing. And in this forecast, both of those things are happening. We now expect Minnesota total wage income to grow at moderate rates of 4.3 to 4.7% per year over the forecast period. As I said, this is slow, and as you can see from the chart, this is slower growth than what we'd anticipated in February. Echoing what I just told you about the U.S. wage growth, Minnesota's forecast changes primarily because actual wage income has come in lower than expected. In February, Minnesota wages had been forecast to grow 3.8% in 2016, and we now know that they grew 1 percentage point more slowly at 2.8%. So that's the largest change that we have and the lowest wage growth that we have, but it's the same story as we had at the U.S. level, where 2016 just came in short. It also appears that wage income has grown more slowly than expected so far this year. 2017 wage income growth is now expected to be 4.3%, down from 4.7% in February. And for Minnesota's forecast, the lower wage growth in 16 and 17 carries forward to lower things a bit going into the out years. The changes to the economic forecast have helped bring down our forecast for tax revenues. Total general fund revenues for fiscal year 18-19 are now forecast to be, as you heard from the commissioner, $559 million less than the February 17 forecast adjusted for law change. So this isn't revenues shrinking, this is a reduction in the forecast for revenues. We have a reduction in the forecast almost across the board, so all the major tax types, only all other revenue has a higher forecast than what we had relative to the prior estimate. And this is relative to, as I said, February 17 forecast adjusted for law changes, as the commissioner mentioned. I want to focus on the individual income tax number there. Individual income tax receipts in the current biennium are now forecast to be $461 million less than the prior estimate. That change is due to the lower forecast growth in wage income from 17 to 19 that I just talked about, and a decrease in our estimate of tax liability for 2016, which is the base year for this forecast. So we start with base year tax liability, and then we grow off of that. At the close of fiscal year 17, net income tax revenue was less than we had forecast. So that shortfall was due to lower, that shortfall at the close of fiscal year 17 was due to lower than expected net tax collections associated with tax year 16 returns. So as I mentioned before on the wage graph, we now know that wage income grew more slowly in 16 than we had forecast, and we know that that's part of the reason that the tax year 16 liability is lower and that the fiscal year 17 receipts are lower. But we also believe, although we won't know until we see data from 2016 tax returns early next year, but we also believe that some of the shortfall was due to lower than expected income from capital gains realizations. We've consequently lowered our forecast of growth in capital gains and in some other forms of non-wage income. And that forecast change, bringing down the forecast for capital gains, is consistent with our observation that so far this year, estimated tax payments, which are prepayments that taxpayers make when they have non-wage income, those estimated tax payments are lower than they were a year ago. So that's consistent with our having a lower expectation for that non-wage income, the capital gains income. New information about income tax revenues that we expect to see between now and February will clarify the picture for the next biennium. We'll clarify the picture on income taxes and we'll clarify the forecast. In early January, we expect to learn the actual tax liability for 2016. At the moment, we don't know what it was. We're estimating it. And again, that's the year that this forecast is based on. Late January should bring new information about those final estimated tax payments. So those estimated tax payments that are coming in short of expectation and lower than last year, we'll know what those are by the time of January, and that will clear things up too. We'll also know the final quarter of withholding for 2017, income tax withholding, which will help us understand what has actually happened with wages this year. So both of those, the estimated payments and the withholding, will help clarify liability, what we think of as for liability for 2017. Finally, in February, we expect to have the first information about 2016 growth rates of various income types, including those capital gains, from a preliminary sample of 2016 tax returns. So let me conclude by drawing your attention to some of the risks in this forecast. As you heard from Commissioner Frans, there is significant uncertainty about U.S. policy, especially fiscal policy, not only the tax bill, but also how Congress will address imminent deadlines to fund the government and raise the debt ceiling. In addition, there's uncertainty about other forms of policy, such as trade and immigration policy. Some of that may be clarified in coming weeks and months, but some of the uncertainty is likely to persist for some time. In this forecast, another risk, inflation is projected to gradually rise from what have been very low rates. However, employing fiscal stimulus late in the business cycle, which is what the tax bill is designed to be, when the U.S. labor market is at or near full employment, could cause prices to rise more quickly than the Federal Reserve prefers, and subsequent actions by the Fed could lead to a different outcome for the economy than what is projected in this outlook. Capital gains realizations are the most volatile income source in our income tax, and they're subject to taxpayers' choice about when to realize those gains. And those taxpayers are watching what's happening at the federal level with taxes and trying to decide when to realize the gains and when to pay tax on those gains. And even small deviations from assumed growth rates for capital gains can compound and produce sizable changes in revenues. And I've already explained the risk that comes from an economy that's in a long, low growth expansion. So I'll now turn it over to Budget Director Kelly.
Thank you, Laura. I am going to walk through the expenditure changes in this forecast and in this biennium, and then talk about the structural balance over the forecast horizon. So first, looking on the screen here, overall spending is increased in this current biennium compared to our end of session forecast, increased by $389 million. And before I talk about the detail of where there's increases and decreases, I want to talk about how closing the books on fiscal 17 has impacted this forecast and spending in particular in fiscal year 18. So this particular forecast, the November forecast, just after we close the books on a biennium, so this happens once every 4 years, we capture what we call carry forward spending. Spending that's authorized to cross the biennium, so made available for more than a current fiscal year. Current law says that all spending cancels at the end of biennium with some exceptions, like legislative spending can carry forward from one biennium to the next. Last session, we enacted health insurance premium subsidy program, and that money was appropriated in fiscal 17 for a 2-year period of time. And so in this forecast, we are capturing all of the spending that carried forward from fiscal 17 into fiscal 18. And so why do we have so much this time around? It's because of that health insurance premium subsidy and transition care appropriation from fiscal year 17. We appropriated $327 million in fiscal 17 for a 2-year period. $56 million was spent in fiscal 17, and we carried forward the balance, $270 million, into fiscal year 18. And that shows on the spending line. It doesn't affect the deficit at all because we're bringing resources in on the top and we're spending the resources on the bottom, and they net out to zero. But when you just look at the spending, you see an increase in spending related to that carry forward. And most of that is in the all other spending line, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But let's start at the top of the table. Education spending, it's up by $121 million from end of session estimates. It's a 0.6% increase on a $19 billion budget. Usually we see education spending change one forecast to the next due to fluctuations in the growth rates of students enrolling in our schools. This forecast, the number of students is virtually unchanged from prior estimates, and the change in education spending is a result of special education. Special education is an expenditure-driven formula, not a population or pupil-based formula like the general education formula. And so spending on special education services by districts has increased faster rate than what was assumed in our February forecast. We have seen growth in the number of students enrolling in special education and receiving those services in each of the past 4 years, as well as districts using resources to hire more staff to lower the child-to-staff ratios. As a result, the cost of special education is increasing, driving our forecast spending upwards. And this trend continues into the next biennium. The next line, property tax aids and credit spending, is up by $7 million compared to end of session estimates. Slower projected income growth, along with property tax growth, is driving the spending for homestead and renters property tax credits. This $17 million increase is offset by decreases in the targeted property tax refund and other aids and credits to counties. The offsets grow in the next biennium, where overall spending for tax aids and credits is lower than the previous forecast. Health and Human Services spending increases only $13 million compared to last forecast, just 0.1%. This is a very small change for Health and Human Services, and it reflects offsetting spending changes that we typically don't see in a forecast. So I'm going to talk about them on the next slide, and I'll go into more detail then. Moving on to debt service, expenditures are lower in the current biennium due to lower interest rates during our fall bond sale and lower projections in the future. We continue to assume that debt costs associated with an $800 million bonding bill for this session. So the all other spending line is significantly higher than we normally see, and that's driven by the spending in the carry forward for the healthcare premium subsidy program. In addition to that spending, there was $10 million deposited into the disaster account. That was based on fiscal year close. We closed the books on fiscal year 17. There was sufficient positive balance. The law directed us to then deposit $10 million into the disaster account in anticipation of future needs. So let's look at Health and Human Services on the next slide. HHS spending fluctuations are typically the results of swings in medical assistance or MA spending, and we see that again in this forecast along with some offsets that we typically don't see. So with this forecast, we're projecting lower than anticipated spending in long-term care programs, $248 million. A trend from prior forecasts is continuing with this forecast. Recent enrollees in the home and community access disability or community-based services program, and specifically the Community Access Disability Inclusion or CADI waiver, are costing less than they had expected in the previous forecast. And similarly, lower average payments and lower enrollment in elderly and disabled basic care program also contribute to the savings. But MA and other savings are offset by several spending increases. First, this is a current law forecast, so we base our spending assumptions on what is in law, both state law and federal law. And the federal law has not appropriated funding for the Children's Health Insurance Program, or the CHIP program. It is a program that's authorized in federal statute, but the funding for it has not yet been appropriated at the federal level. And we are uncertain about the willingness of congressional leadership to appropriate for that program. Most recently, they authorized or talked about making available to states funding that has been authorized in prior appropriation bills, but not looking at authorizing future appropriations. So we have assumed that the Children's Health Insurance Program costs will fall to the state. And we have increased spending in our medical assistance program corresponding to that by $178 million in fiscal year 18-19, a much smaller amount in fiscal years 20 and 21. Second, the legislature in 2015 enacted a statutory mechanism to transfer money to the Healthcare Access Fund, depending on the progress Minnesota is making to lower spending on certain chronic diseases. So yesterday, the Minnesota Department of Health released their report that state-administered spending on these conditions in 2014 was lower than projected by more than $50 million. And this triggered the transfer from the general fund to the Healthcare Access Fund to reimburse that fund for some of its spending on those programs. So finally, the budget that we adopted last year included contingent spending in the Health and Human Services area of the budget. Both items were contingent on savings in the health insurance premium subsidy program. With this forecast, MMB is certifying that lower enrollment in the program will result in $99 million of savings in that program. And those savings will be allocated first to buy back a managed care rate reduction that was assumed in the budget, and second for DHS operating costs. So the budget assumed that managed care rates would grow 0.5% less than forecast and made a contingent appropriation to DHS if this lower trend could not be achieved. And DHS has certified with this forecast that it is not achievable. So $17 million in fiscal year 18-19 and another $65 million in 20 and 21 are allocated from the savings in the health insurance premium subsidy program. So we have $248 million of savings being offset by $261 million of cost increases in the health and human services area. So if we look ahead to the 20 and 21 biennium, we are projecting a negative balance in both biennia, a negative structural balance in both biennia. This table here speaks to the structural balance, or in this case with this forecast, the structural imbalance, where we're looking at just the revenues collected within the biennium compared to the spending obligations within that same biennium. And you can see 1.5 billion structural imbalance in 18-19, 337 million next biennium. Annual revenue growth is 3.5% compared to 2.2% for spending. And just a reminder that with a few exceptions, inflation is not in the spending forecast, but it does impact the ability of state agencies to deliver current services. And our inflation estimates are a little higher with this forecast, between 2.4 and 2.6%. And with that, I will turn it back to Commissioner Frans.
So here's what we know. Today's forecast projects a deficit for the current biennium. The February forecast, we believe, will provide a clearer picture about the finances of our state. With the 2018 legislative session set to begin on February 20, there is time for state leaders to come together and solve this deficit or whatever we're faced with in the February forecast. Here's what we don't know. We don't know how long the current economic expansion will continue. We don't know whether a tax bill will be passed at the federal level and how that tax bill will impact Minnesota. We don't know how other federal legislation and policy decisions being discussed could impact Minnesota's budget and economic situation. As with every forecast, it's my job to stress the possible risk and also to remind us of when it's time to exercise caution in our budget decision. And now is that time. Our budget reserves are currently, as I mentioned, $1.6 billion. While it may seem like this makes today's projected deficit an easy fix, I need to remind us about why our reserves are often referred to as a rainy day fund. They are meant to be used in times of economic downturn. In other words, in my verbiage, today's forecast is more of a mist than a downpour. But a federal policy change or a new law passed by Congress that negatively impacts our budget could become a rainy day, or a recession is certainly a rainy day with perhaps a thunderstorm thrown in. We need to be cautious about when we use our reserves. While we could dip into the reserve to address today's deficit, I want to say as a state budget chief that a deficit caused by a slight downturn in economic revenue projection is a deficit that we can manage through smart budgeting with the governor and the legislature coming together. Since being elected in 2011, Governor Dayton has focused on fiscal responsibility, and he has righted the fiscal ship after a decade of deficits. As a result of the past 8 forecasts, we have projected positive balances for all of those. Under his brand of sound fiscal management, we restored the state's credit rating to AAA. We built our rainy day fund balance up to over $2 billion when you look at the $1.6 billion in the reserve account and $350 million in the cash account. Throughout my time of overseeing the budget, you have heard me stress the importance of making smart investments in the future of our state and living within our means. I've warned that it only takes one wrong move to turn a positive balance into a deficit. For those of you who recall, back in 1999, Minnesota had very large positive budget balances. We collectively ignored that uncertainty and risk in that economic expansion and made decision to implement long-term permanent tax cuts. Shortly after that decision, the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 and the state's positive balances turned into deficits 9 out of the next 11 years. So I repeated that story back in February, and I tell it again to stress how permanent tax cuts can lead to deficits. But on the last slide, I just want to, in conclusion, mention that our forecast fundamentals are strong. Our economy and wages continue to grow, although more slowly, and our unemployment rate is lower than the U.S. rate. At the same time, until policy changes at the federal level become more clear, their impact on the economy remains sources of risk for this forecast, both upside and downside. And finally, the U.S. is in one of the longest economic expansions on record. We do not know how long the expansion will continue, and it is important we seriously consider the risk when we make budget decisions this next legislative session. We are fortunate to have the luxury of time on our side. We will have better information in February, and we will have a late start to the next legislative session. And who knows, in February, maybe the Vikings will actually win the Super Bowl. Stranger things have happened. So with that, we'd like to welcome your questions.
Commissioner, what about the rainy day fund? It sounds like you're not predicting rain. It's a mist, not a downpour. Does that mean don't go into the reserve funds?
Well, the budget, let me just explain the budget rules for deficits. The budget rules provide that the commissioners shall use the reserves to solve a budget deficit with the approval of the governor and after consultation with the Legislative Audit Committee. So there is no timing specified in that particular statute. So it gives us some flexibility to work for the governor to consider what he wants to do. You may recall that he's already mentioned his decision to wait until after the February forecast to make any recommendations regarding whatever budget considerations he wants to consider this next session. He's also inclined at this point to wait and see what happens with the February forecast before we rush in and solve this deficit with the existing budget reserve.
But you hinted at your counsel. What is it specifically?
My counsel is to wait. That I think that there are enough variables that should clear up some. We have to be careful, though, because every time we get up here, we say there are risks, and there are a lot of risks, and every forecast has its risk. Until the biennium is over, we don't know what's going to happen for the next 20 months. But we do feel that there are a number of things that could happen in the next several months that could provide some insight that would help clarify what we should do or what February forecast deficit or surplus we'll have. So I recommend that we wait.
So Commissioner, if the CHIP program gets reauthorized by Congress, would we just subtract that 178 million from the short-term budget deficit?
Essentially, if it follows the path of prior appropriation, our budget deficit would be $10 million.
Not including the legislative funding that was vetoed?
Correct. I'm referring to the official deficit of 188 million. With the legislative funding, it's 302 million.
Commissioner, if I could just ask, obviously the federal bill is still being molded, but the figures, there are figures out there, there are parameters out there. Have you run and analyzed these? I would think you'd have to, and if so, what is the range of potential impact on Minnesota?
We don't know actually yet. I mean, because there's a Senate bill and the House bill haven't been reconciled. Obviously, that'll be going on this week or next week. So until we get the actual bill language and review it, we'll not be ready to make those estimates about what that means for Minnesota. And the other thing, that's a big variable, number one, what actually is going to be passed. And number two, there's also the variable, what kind of conformity will Minnesota engage in? Because depending upon the kinds of changes made at the federal level, it will require at least some, if not a lot, of federal conformity. And that involves another whole level of decision by the state leaders to decide how much conformity they want to get to. So a long answer to your question is we don't know. We will be looking at that bill once it's passed, but we don't know yet what the results will be for Minnesota.
There's some pent-up demand for more spending from groups outside the building. What's your message to them from this forecast?
Well, any proposals for spending from anyone really have to be carefully considered, because at this point with the deficit, we're going to have to figure out how do you pay for it. I mean, it's obviously one thing to decide when we had a $1.65 billion surplus in February this year. There was plenty of opportunity to decide how to invest those dollars. But if you want to invest in spending, then you're also going to be incumbent, I think, to come forward with ways to how to pay for that. So I think that's going to be the cautioning effect on all those folks who recommend spending is how do we pay for it. But I think we'll actually one of the reasons the governor wants to wait until the February forecast to make that final decision.
Can you talk again about the tax cuts and transportation funding enacted last session and how those items impact this forecast?
So what happened in the last session, as we mentioned, we had $1.65 billion surplus. And after enacting the tax cuts and the spending, the tax cuts were $657 million, and the spending was $816 million. Those are the net numbers. There are other offsets, in a more technical way. But those were the numbers that lowered the revenue base for the tax bill, and then they increased the spending base on the spending side. So those were the new positions from which our new forecast is made from, was after those revenues were reduced, after that spending was implemented. Now we're increasing our spending estimate by Budget Director Kelly, and we're reducing the revenue forecast on that particular base. So the purpose of talking about that was to show that we created a new base after the February forecast.
Commissioner, I'm guessing Republicans are going to come out here later and say, especially in the 2018-19 biennium, coming with $188 million, or maybe as little as $10 million, or whatever the figure ends up being with the legislative veto. That's actually pretty good budgeting. It's pretty close to a balanced budget when you consider it's $45 billion budget. How would you respond to that?
Well, your idea of a balanced budget is a little bit different than mine. $188 million is significant. I think one of the things you also have to examine is the way that we have to run our state the way we want to run it, but we do also want credit rating agencies to view the state in a positive light. And part of the reason we restored the AAA credit rating last year was the fact that we've maintained budget balance after budget balance. We've increased our reserve amounts, and we've lived within our means. They're going to be watching this and seeing how we respond to this, I think, in the next session. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we show the rest of the world that a balanced budget is important to us, and we'll maintain that. You're right, though. I mean, it's not, the sky is not falling kind of a budget deficit, but it's concerning. And so I would say that I'm concerned about it, and I want to wait till we get more information in February to decide to recommend how we fix it. But it's still significant.
I have an economist question. Can't let her get by without something. We're talking a little bit about the differences in the economy from mining to retail to manufacturing in Minnesota.
Sure. So, I was thinking about how, I was thinking about that 2016 number, how GDP was low, it was a low growth year. And what we were talking about a lot then was the strong US dollar and how that was affecting exports and causing things to grow more slowly. And so that is one of the factors that is waning now. The strong US dollar is fading a bit, and global growth is actually doing quite well. No major economy is in a recession, and so demand for exported goods is better than it was prior. And so exporters are doing well, and manufacturers are doing well, and hiring has been happening in those areas. This year saw some very positive news for iron ore mining in Minnesota. That was due to global demand, and Minnesota, the Iron Range exported an extraordinary amount of value this year, and so that's been positive. It's a volatile economy, so there are going to be ups and there are going to be downs, but it's nice to see some people getting back to work in that industry. Construction has added jobs recently. Home building is an interesting area where there's high demand for homes. There are limitations, however, on developable lots in some places, and the tight labor market that I talked about makes it a little more of a challenge for firms to hire people, but we've seen jobs being added there.
Does this forecast assume NAFTA stays as is?
Yes, it assumes no change to trade policy. And so trade policy is one of the risks to this forecast. Minnesota's major trading partners are Mexico and Canada. And so that's something that I'm sure the farmers and the miners and the manufacturers of Minnesota are looking at.
If I could follow up on housing, Their household formations had been trending down. I didn't
Yeah.
hear specifically, are we doing any better on that stat?
The recent data, the recent actual data is low on that. And so, but in our forecast, we do anticipate some pickup in household formations. You know, this is something that has lagged in this recovery. It's been slower than expected. But I think we're starting to see some signs that that's going to pick up.
And why? Do we have any reason
Why it's been slow?
Why it might be picking
Why-
up? But, yeah, I mean, we had guessed that college debt was,
Yep.
you know, pushing that down. Do we have a sense why it might be picking up?
So we would anticipate household formations to pick up as jobs increase and as wages and salaries pick up. So the idea is that people who have postponed buying a house because they didn't get quite as good a job as they thought they were going to coming right out of school, that those opportunities have improved. And so that's why it should pick up. But it still has been a low number throughout this expansion.
All right, the governor will be here in a moment, so I think we're gonna take one more question and then.
Beyond some
Commissioner
economic-
Frans, if we could, because the rhetorical barrage has already started. How much has the tax cuts that Republicans pushed through exacerbated the situation, if at all?
Well, we got to remember, when you look at a budget, there's two components to every budget. One of them is the math, and one of them are the values that you attribute to those different elements. So from the math point of view, whether it's $1 of spending or $1 of tax cuts, they add to the deficit. So in this particular case, the budget that was passed, which included tax cuts and included spending, it's that budget that's causing the deficit. So you have to be honest and deal with both of those, and they need to be coordinated so that they don't spend too much money. Clearly, different people have different views about what parts of the budget are more important to them or more valuable to them or espouse their values. So the value judgments can be made, but the math is the math.
So the governor's investments are as much to blame, as it were, as Republicans' tax cuts?
Well, I think one way to look at it is, one of the things that Dr. Kalambokidis talks about is the fact that we don't have a lot of state-specific risks in Minnesota, and so a lot of the risks that we are experiencing are those federal budget risks and uncertainties that are going on at the national level or even international level. So we're buffeted somewhat by those. I mean, those have had an effect as well, but clearly it was the combined budget that led to the final deficit, to be fair.
No, it's fine. Beyond the expectations of some economic growth, if a tax bill were to pass, this is probably a question for Dr. Kalambokidis. How might you expect tax collections to change among people who have perhaps been holding off on filing or making transactions for a new tax bill to come?
So that's one of the uncertainties in this forecast, is that just as we are watching what's going on in Washington, taxpayers are too. And so, as I said, if we have I talked about capital gains as being one of the things that can be variable depending on what people think their coming tax rates will be. So in this forecast, based on collections that we've seen so far, we've lowered that expectation. But if something changes and people decide that they're going to, take some profits off of a portfolio that has increased in value, then we'll see more revenue than we had expected.